Hey y'all, welcome back again to another episode of Healthy Design. So today I figure we kind of start going through another book. This time we'll go through Eat Rich, Live Long. It's by Ivor Cummings and Dr. Gerber. So part of the reason I want to go through some of these books or have been going through is I know a lot of people, they're DIYers, so even when it comes to health, they want to do it themselves. And these are some of the books that I think have the best information in them. Let's see, I think the 30 Genes and Eat Rich, Live Long, I think they were published in 2018. So, 7, 8 years. And then, again, close to 8 years. And then, let's see, While We Get Sick was 2020. So, they're not exactly new books, but I can't say I've seen something newer that kind of discusses things. And I really like the Eat Rich, Live Long. So I do think they give you some ideas on kind of how to tailor things to yourself as well. But one of the things I would recommend for this and for all the other things, most time people have something to sell. And so they're going to focus on what makes them different than the other things. And so that's why I think it is you see so much different information when it comes to health, when it comes to weight loss, different things like that. The key is not to focus on the differences, focus on what successful systems have in common. If you'll see these commonalities between them all. Those are the things that matter, and those are the things that work. The things that are different, that's not the main thing. That might be the main thing for that person, or one thing that works for that person or this group of people, and then this difference works a little bit better for this group and that one. But they still have those foundations the same, and that's what needs to be in place for everybody. So I think if you can kind of look at things that way, see what the commonalities are, you can kind of start to piece some things together, at least get the basics. And then once you got the basics down, then experimenting with some of those different things can make a big difference for you. And it might help you to kind of piece together what works best for you. But, just trying to hop from one thing to the other doesn't really help. From the diet side, if someone goes from eating the standard American diet to eating carnivore, they're probably going to improve and get better. Their health's going to be better and things. Same thing if they go from eating a standard American diet to eating vegetarian, where they are actually eating vegetables and not just eating processed foods, their health is going to improve and they're going to be better. Why is that? Well, they got rid of all the highly processed food. So you look for those commonalities. I'm not trying to say like vegetarian is the way to eat or carnivore is the way to eat. I'm just saying if you look at those two diametrically opposed eating, patterns, the one thing they have in common versus that standard American diet is they're not having processed food. So find those commonalities. That can make things a lot easier for you to figure out. But the Eat Rich, Live Long book, it is one designed kind of more for weight loss, but also improving health at the same time. And I do like that it kind of gives you a background for how the whole diet heart hypothesis came into play, goes into showing how it's easily proved that that's incorrect. And then it gives you guidelines on what to do. So we're kind of in part one, starting with that. And that's kind of what we'll talk about. So in 1977, the government passed, let's see, what did they call it then? The diet, the dietary goals for the United States. That later became the dietary guidelines for Americans, since that's the food pyramid and all that kind of stuff. It promoted a low-fat diet, and it was adopted because heart rate or heart disease rates were going up, and so they were trying to come up with something. Hold on one second. Come here. Oh, I guess Stormy didn't want to come in my lap. Um, so heart disease risks or rates were going up, and so they wanted to come up with a way, what was causing it, what can we do about it, how can we bring it down. So those things are good. It's just they kind of came to some wrong conclusions. And a lot of times I think people believe that all scientists agree. Scientists are people. Nobody agrees on, you don't ever have full agreement of everyone on anything. And so same with this, same with other things in science. You're going to have differing opinions. the president of the National Academy of Science, he didn't agree with the low-fat recommendations. Not saying that he necessarily thought something else was in place. He just didn't think that's what the government should do. And here's what he is quoted as saying: "What right has the federal government to propose that the American people conduct a vast nutritional experiment with themselves as subjects on the face of so little evidence?" So he's not really sharing what he does believe. He's just pointing out that there's not a lot of evidence to support this yet. We're going to adopt this for the whole nation. And it should be noted that experiments were performed to prove that fat was bad because it increased cholesterol. However, those trials failed. They didn't show that. And so, for the majority of people, dietary fat does little to nothing to affect their cholesterol levels. It doesn't raise those levels meaningfully. Um, since those guidelines were adopted, obesity rates and the rates of diabetes, type 2 diabetes has increased, and we kind of have epidemics of those things now. The American Heart Association did play a role in getting that low-fat dietary guidelines passed in 1977, and they pushed low-fat diets for decades. But in 2015, the AHA published a report, Heart Disease and Stroke Statistics. Excuse me. One thing that was reported in that study was that out of 5 big randomized trials, they demonstrated that total fat consumption did not affect rates of coronary heart disease or stroke. So that's a pretty big finding. They're showing that in these randomized trials, so with people, that it didn't have any effect on coronary heart disease or stroke rates. The report also showed that for each 5% reduction in saturated fat that is replaced, so each 5% reduction of saturated fat in your diet that's replaced with carbohydrates leads to a 7% increased risk of coronary heart disease. Now that's associational data, so it's just showing there's a correlation there. Doesn't mean it's causing it, it's just showing correlation. In 2015, it should be noted too that the dietary guidelines, they quietly dropped, cholesterol and fat as being from the no-no list. So before they were kind of like, don't want to consume these. Then they just kind of quietly left those off, but they didn't really talk about it much. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, they also said, quote, "Saturated fat is to be de-emphasized from nutrients of concern, given the lack of evidence connecting it with cardiovascular disease." So as you see, we had this for decades where we have to be low fat to be healthy, and it's going to decrease our heart rate risk, going to decrease strokes and all these different things. But yet there were different studies showing that wasn't the case. Um, but no one really came out and said all this just explicitly. It's just kind of been quietly done. So Nina Teicholz has a book, Big Fat Surprise, where she really goes into depth on a whole bunch of this, part of what we'll talk about later too. So if you really want to get more, that's what I would go read. It's fascinating. She's done different podcasts too that you can find. Um, then the book kind of moves on a little bit. So it talks about protein. And one thing that I think people forget about protein is your body needs it for one. I've mentioned that many times, but your hunger a lot of times is related to that. So you'll kind of keep eating until your body gets enough protein. And if you end up having too little protein, it won't be long before you have different health issues. Fat, again, the Institute of Medicine says that we need dietary fat intake to be approximately 20% or a minimum of 20% of our diet. If you eat too little, you're going to have health concerns again. Carbohydrates, there can be some benefits. The slowly digesting, so like some from fruits and vegetables, can have a benefit for our gut health. But there actually is no minimum. You could eat 0 carbs. Your body has a way to make them. Again, not saying that's the best way to eat, and eat rich, live long is not saying that's the best way to eat 0 carb either. But they're just saying, given the other two, they are definitely essential carbohydrates. You technically can go on 0 and be just fine. Then they move into talking about pillars of proof for research. And this is getting into Ansel Keys and the dietary heart hypothesis. And pillar 1 to kind of prove anything is the associational data. Again, everybody's heard the saying, correlation does not prove causation. But if there is no correlation there, why would you look into it in the first place? So, you know, you can't make conclusions from this type of research and this type of evidence, but it does give you a reason to look further into something. So if the correlation is high enough, then we need further studies. If the correlation is too low or there's no correlation at all, there's no need to keep looking. So hopefully that makes sense. Pillar two, you got to find some mechanism data. So there has to, can this actually physically occur? Can A physically cause B? If it can't, again, we kind of don't need to keep looking. So there's no reason to go on there. Pillar three, that's where you have the experimental evidence, and this is where like randomized, controlled trials are going to be very good. They can kind of show some proof for things. Again, I say show proof because in science, you have a theory, you keep doing experiments, and so you may keep getting evidence that supports that theory, but you can never prove it because all you need is one experiment to not go with a theory, and then that disproves it, and then it has to be changed. Um, so that's why I always say it kind of shows proof, keeps demonstrating it, and so there's issues there because you have to look to make sure that those studies are designed well. Are they really only changing one variable, or are they changing multiple variables? And then you don't know which one caused what. And then also you have to look at were all the interactional elements taken into account. So confounding variables, things that could have been there and changed things. Was that taken into account too? So I mean, those experiments are hard to design properly. It takes a lot to do that. Um, you do better on those if you have strong evidence from all three pillars. If they are all lining up solidly, it kind of gives a lot more credence to that idea. If, again, with that RCT or that pillar three, you can have that evidence that supports something, and that can kind of stand on its own. But again, it's better if you have all three. So Ansel Keys, he really kind of clung to that pillar one evidence. Um, that's again just associational. Correlation does not equal causation. And so he started looking into this like in the 50s. It's unclear to me why he kind of went this way. I guess he just didn't like dietary fat and different things. But at that same time, latitude, sun exposure, and sugar were more correlated with heart disease risk than fat was. So, again, it doesn't kind of make sense why he went that way unless it was just something he wanted to do. And so then he published a 6-country study, and I can't remember all the countries that were in there. U.S., England, Wales, Australia. I remember a few, and I mean, it showed this nice curve that as you increase dietary fat and stuff, then the rates of heart disease went up. And so, I mean, that's very compelling evidence. However, there were 16 other countries too that were looked at, and when you add those in on that graph, you can't draw any line. It's just a scatter graph. You got points here, 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 here. They're just all over. There's no meaningful way to say like it has any correlation there. So that should have kind of already stopped us moving down that path, but it didn't. Oh, and it should be noted that he got kind of ridiculed for this. He did I think a presentation or a meeting with the WHO. They didn't like it, and then a paper was published in, let me see, the New York State Journal of Medicine. I don't know anything about it. I'm not saying it's the most prestigious journal, but they kind of show that that information really doesn't make sense, especially when you consider all those other countries. So then he changed things up. He did a 7-country study, and he did change some of the countries in there. US was still included, but I think Australia was left out. Finland might have been added, Yugoslavia. So he did look at some different countries. So he cherry picked the countries. It included 12,700 men. There were no women, and it only sampled a percentage of their dietary info. Um, Again, you can find information about that in Nina Teicholz's book. If I remember right, I think there was some fasting involved based on religion and different things, but I'm not positive on that. Um, so again, that 7-country study kind of showed that same, increased fat in the diet led to increased coronary heart disease. And so then you might wonder, well, has that ever been looked at again? And the answer would be yes. So in 2017, the PURE study, and that's, P stands for something, U for something. I don't remember that off the top of my head. Just you can look up PURE study, but it was published. So this was a 7-year long study. It included 135,335 men and women, and from 18 different countries. And the results that it obtained did not agree with the 7-country study. So, in general, it found that there was no association with overall fat intake or saturated fat and coronary heart disease or stroke or mortality in general. Sorry, not stroke, mortality in general. And it did actually show that higher saturated fat intake had some benefits, like lower stroke rates, but increased carb intake was associated with increased mortality. This kind of lines up with that 2015 report from the American Heart Association. So, and one thing I want to show or say about, again, going to that correlational associational data, you had the 6-country study that kind of was trying to show one thing. And then when you add the other 16 countries in, it shows something else. And my point is not that it proves anything, but what it does show is that when you look at enough things, there is no correlation there. So there shouldn't have been that continuation down that path. It's not proof in and of itself. So I'm not trying to kind of cling to that one piece of associational data. And then moving on to pillar 3, there actually were experiments performed even in the 60s and 70s, and they didn't show any that fat was linked with heart disease. But those studies were ignored because that didn't go with what Ansel Keys wanted. He wanted to show that fat was bad, cholesterol was bad. Um, in 2015, again, we had a paper published that showed that evidence from the random, clinical controlled trials did not support the dietary fat guidelines in 1977-83. I think that was published in like British, medical journal, something like that. Um, and then one of those trials, it was not published initially. It took 16 years for it to be published, and then it was published in a very kind of minor journal so that it wouldn't be readily seen by a whole bunch of people. And the reason why that was done, and this is a quote from the principal investigator on that study, we were just so disappointed in the way it turned out. So the results they got from their study did not show, fat having anything to do with heart disease, and so they didn't want to publish it because it didn't go with what they wanted to show. That's again not kind of how science should be done. And again, scientists are people, so that's why we can't just take science as being truth no matter what. We have to look into things and kind of be a little bit more discerning. One of the biggest trials, they did actually lower fat intake to around 20%, and they got saturated fat intake to around 7% of the diet, but they didn't see any improvement in heart disease rates. They didn't see any other health outcome improvement either. So again, just these trials don't show that same thing that you get with those associational data. So again, we should have moved on from it instead of continuing with it. Now, one thing that has been linked with coronary heart disease are trans fats, and you get the trans fats from the hydrogenated oils, and most of those have been banned. Now, they've come up with some different things. We don't know exactly what happens with those yet. Who knows what we'll find out in a few years? Maybe they're fine, maybe they're not. I don't know. Everybody thought the hydrogenated oils were going to be fine, and then decades later we find out, oh, no, they're actually not that good. So that's kind of how things go sometimes. So that's kind of the first couple chapters of the book. Um, I think it's good to have some of that background information on how we got started with the whole cholesterol and fat being unhealthy and not good for us, and then kind of some evidence to show, okay, wait, that's not the case. And so when people are saying that, they're not just trying to be different or argumentative. I mean, I do tend to be contrary, so I'm not in this case. There's reasons for it. Um, so I just think it's good to have some of that background information. We'll continue going through the book, and then we'll get into some more practical ways of how to apply some of this to yourself so that you can lose weight, improve your health. And again, with all the books, what I would look for is what are the things they have in common. We saw a lot of commonalities between dirty jeans and kind of what to do about stuff with the soak and scrub and the spot clean. It had some different specific things in there that were not in Why We Get Sick, but a lot of things were the same. Managing stress, exercise, and eating a diet that's appropriate. So there's all kinds of things in there, and I think you're going to see the same thing in this book too. So I appreciate you guys watching. Sorry if Stormy was being loud. She's definitely a little bit hyper this morning, but hopefully everything came through well. Please like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and I guess I'll see you next time. Bye.